This episode contains discussions of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care while listening. By 1979, after years of murders, failed leads, growing media pressure, and increasing public fear, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had become one of the largest and most emotionally charged criminal investigations in Britain. Women across Yorkshire were living inside an atmosphere shaped increasingly by caution, fear, and uncertainty, whilst investigators faced mounting pressure to identify the man responsible before more lives were lost. And prolonged uncertainty creates powerful pressure for certainty to finally emerge from confusion. Because human beings struggle to tolerate unresolved fear indefinitely. We seek explanations, patterns, answers capable of restoring emotional order to situations that no longer feel emotionally predictable or manageable. And when uncertainty lasts long enough, even flawed certainty can begin feeling preferable to endless ambiguity. That reality would become one of the most significant psychological factors shaping the direction of the investigation from this point onward. Because by now people were no longer simply searching for truth, they were searching for relief. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles. Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 8, The Voice on the Tape. By the late 1970s, women including Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Jean Jordan, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, and others had been murdered or violently attacked across Yorkshire and the surrounding areas, leaving behind grieving families, devastated loved ones, and communities struggling to comprehend violence many experienced as almost inhuman. Meanwhile, the investigation had expanded into one of the largest manhunts in British criminal history. Police forces were facing enormous public pressure to identify the man responsible as fear, media attention, and frustration continued intensifying year after year. And investigators were now operating inside an atmosphere shaped not only by urgency, but by emotional exhaustion and growing desperation for progress. Because prolonged uncertainty changes the way that human beings process information. Not because intelligence disappears. Not because people stop thinking carefully. But because uncertainty itself becomes increasingly difficult to tolerate over long periods of time. And that reality matters enormously in cases like this. Because investigations are conducted by human beings. As human beings, we are affected by stress, by fear, by urgency, by criticism, by pressure from the public, media, institutions, and from within themselves. And prolonged pressure can begin narrowing perception over time. That narrowing is sometimes referred to as cognitive narrowing or tunnel vision, a state where increasing emotional investment in one interpretation can make alternative possibilities more difficult to fully consider. Not necessarily because people are careless, but because certainty begins feeling increasingly necessary. It was within this atmosphere that investigators received a series of letters claiming to have been written by the killer. The letters mocked investigators directly, criticised police failures, and claimed responsibility for the murders in taunting and increasingly provocative language. At first, investigators remained cautious, but attention surrounding the letters intensified significantly after the arrival of an audio tape that contained a man's voice claiming responsibility for the horrific crimes. And hearing a voice changes things, because human beings often experience spoken communication differently from written words. A voice feels personal, immediate, human. And hearing somebody speak can create a powerful sense of authenticity and emotional proximity. After years of uncertainty, the tape appeared to offer investigators something they had struggled to secure throughout the case: direction. A distinct regional accent. A personality. A possible identity attached to years of violence and fear. And that kind of apparent clarity can feel enormously significant inside an investigation overwhelmed by uncertainty. The speaker became known publicly as Wearside Jack. And as focus surrounding the tape intensified, belief in its authenticity increasingly strengthened both publicly and institutionally. One of the most important things to understand about this stage of the investigation is that the tape did not emerge inside calm or emotionally neutral conditions. It emerged after years of violence, fear, frustration, and mounting pressure to finally identify the man responsible. And human beings often become more vulnerable to certainty when uncertainty has existed for too long. Because certainty creates relief, even temporary relief, even flawed relief. The tape appeared to provide answers at a moment where answers felt desperately needed. And once people begin emotionally investing in a particular explanation, confirmation bias can begin strengthening around it. Confirmation bias refers to the tendency human beings have to prioritize information supporting existing beliefs, while unconsciously minimizing information that challenges them. And importantly, this is not something experienced only by those who society deems as unintelligent. It is a deeply human cognitive process, especially under stress, especially under pressure, and especially when emotional exhaustion has existed for years. Because once investigators began believing the voice may genuinely belong to the killer, more and more of the investigation began organising itself around that belief. And organised certainty can feel reassuring, even when it remains incomplete. Once details of the tape became public, media coverage intensified dramatically. Newspapers, television reports, and public discussion increasingly focused upon the voice believed to be belonging to the killer. And that shifted the atmosphere surrounding the case once again. Because fear no longer existed only through reports of violence. Now it had a voice attached to it. That matters psychologically. Because human beings often respond more intensely to threats that feel personalised. A voice creates identity, presence, humanity, and that can make fear feel more immediate and psychologically real. People listened. People discussed. People speculated. And many wanted desperately to believe the investigation was finally moving toward resolution. Because after years of fear and uncertainty, the possibility of progress carried enormous emotional weight. But emotionally powerful beliefs are not always accurate beliefs. And that distinction would become critically important. While attention increasingly focused upon the tape, the wider emotional consequences of the case continued unfolding far beyond the investigation itself. Families were grieving. Daughters, sisters, mothers, and loved ones whose lives had been permanently taken by violence. Communities across Yorkshire continued living inside prolonged fear and uncertainty. Women changed routines that had once felt ordinary. Journeys became calculated differently. Ordinary independence increasingly carried emotional negotiation around safety and risk. And that sustained fear carried consequences extending far beyond the headlines and investigative strategies. Because whilst the investigation narrowed increasingly towards the voice on the tape, the real killer remained unidentified. And that distinction would ultimately carry devastating consequences. As focus surrounding the tape intensified, investigative attention increasingly narrowed towards suspects believed capable of matching the accent and background associated with Wearside Jack. And narrowing focus can initially feel productive. It creates direction. structure, a sense that confusion is finally becoming manageable. But narrowing also carries risk. Because once emotional certainty becomes strongly attached to one interpretation, contradictory information can become more difficult to emotionally prioritize with equal weight. Not ignored entirely, but increasingly filtered through the growing belief that the correct explanation has already been found. And this is one of the most psychologically important aspects of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Not because mistakes were made by uniquely flawed people, but because prolonged fear, pressure, and emotional exhaustion can influence cognition in deeply human ways, especially when uncertainty has remained unresolved for years. Looking back, it can be tempting to view the Wearside tape only through hindsight, to focus entirely on what many later felt investigators should have recognised sooner. But hindsight removes emotional atmosphere from events. It removes exhaustion. It removes pressure or urgency, and the emotional need for uncertainty to finally end. And that context matters, because understanding how human beings become vulnerable to false certainty is often far more valuable than simply criticising them for experiencing it. The investigation had not simply become desperate to solve the case. By now it had become desperate for emotional resolution itself. And that desperation would shape the direction of the investigation in ways that would carry profound consequences moving forward. Before I close, it's important for us to take a moment to step away from the investigation, the media attention, and any psychological analysis, and return to the people at the centre of the case itself. Because behind every headline, every theory, every letter, and every recording existed real lives, permanently altered by violence. Lives with relationships, families, histories. Ordinary moments that mattered independently of the public narrative surrounding the investigation. And recognising that matters, because without that recognition, it becomes too easy to focus only on the psychology of the investigation, whilst losing sight of the human cost beneath it. In the next episode, we continue exploring the consequences of narrowing certainty, examining how investigative focus, public pressure, and prolonged emotional exhaustion continued shaping the direction of the Yorkshire Ripper case. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.